Hi, this is Misha, and I thought we would finally do a video on the Glock, obviously, because it's on the table. Oh, yeah, where to begin? First off, I am in no way an expert, because it's just not my cup of tea, so this is just kind of being my little take on it, the history, the slight evolution. There's so much to be said about the Glock, you could do a 2-hour video and probably still not hit it all up, because it has been around since 1981 and has seen extensive police and civilian use and even some military use. So we'll just kind of go into the history and look at the generations briefly and, you know, whatever. There's a reason I'm doing this video today and I'll explain it later on. This is the original Glock 17, known today as a Gen I, Generation 1. This one was produced in 1987, so it's a relatively late Gen 1, but still very much a Gen 1. So how did this gun come to be? By modern standards, this is a pretty conventional gun. We have a 4.5-inch barrel, polymer frame, double stack polymer, 17-shot mag. Well, we can argue about the nomenclature of this trigger, but this Glock safe-action trigger has been used in so many guns that, you know, by today's standards, this is very standard. But for the late 70s, early 80s, nothing like this really existed. Well, as the 80s rolled around, the only real polymer-framed handgun in production was the HK VP70. And it was not very successful for multiple reasons, mostly because it sucked. And in 1980, the Austrian military finally decided it needed a new service weapon. It had been using old Walther P.38s left over from World War II, such as this one here. This is a double single-action gun with a decocker, all steel, 8-shot. Perfectly good gun. In fact, West Germany was still using the P1 in the 80s, but it's getting dated. Now, they did also have some FN Browning high powers. While this is single action only, it does utilize a 13-shot mag, double stack, single feed. So it has that over the Walther. And these are pretty much the two standard guns in Austrian military service at the time. But they were aging, they needed a new one. The new gun needed to fire the 9x19 parabellum round. It needed to be simpler, of course, which is always the name of the game, and easier to mass produce. They also had a lot of concerns about safety. They wanted the new gun to be safe to operate. They wanted it to have under 60 parts, the fewer the better. They wanted it to be able to go several thousand rounds without failures. They wanted it to be able to be operated one-handed. They had several requirements, pretty typical, nothing extraordinary by today's standards. And they would try out about a dozen different pistols would go in the trials. You had several entries from HK, the P7, including the M8 and the M13, also the P9. Beretta would submit a version of the M92. SIG would submit a version in the 220 family, kind of a forerunner of the 226 in that whole area. You will also see a submission by Steyr, who is obviously an Austrian company. That would be the GB. And honestly, this was considered to be the sure thing, who was going to win. Steyr had been producing the AUG for the military. They had produced miniguns for the military before. The GB was essentially a modernized gun. It used a gas system. It was a high capacity, 18 shots. It was also quite heavy, but it was a more modern gun than a P.38. But in a way, it was also very conventional, being metal and bulky. Well, that was until Gaston Glock got involved. Glock, as a company, had never produced a firearm before, as is famously known. It had done military contracts for other things. It was big into knives. It also did some home goods, such as curtain rods. It was used to working with the military, but on tertiary items, never a standard issue gun. Well, what Gaston Glock did, he pretty much culled the major minds of Europe, beginning in 1979, 1980, got them together, formed a team, set it off in 1981, and within 3-4 months, they had the first prototypes ready to go. And several of these early Glock pistol prototypes would go into the Austrian trials, and they swept it away. They won in 1982 with the Glock Pattern 17, this version here. It was kind of an interesting decision. Rather than kind of playing it safe with the GB, the Austrian military went with a complete unknown. They really went ultra modern. I guess after having kind of obsolescent pistols for nearly 40 years, they decided just to jump ahead. You see this in history from time to time. Look at what Germany did. They went from the old revolvers to the Luger. You know, kind of the same idea. Let's just skip ahead. And they really did. The Glock 17, as most people know, it uses a modified Browning style system, which is today considered pretty much the standard, where this barrel locks into the slide. As I said, we have the safe action system, where there's a lever on the trigger that has to be pressed in before it can be pulled. Then it's a dead trigger till it cocks again. We don't have an external safety. All your safeties are inside. Over the years, they would increase the safeties, but they always had a pretty safe reputation because that was one of the major requirements of the Austrian military trials. Firing pin safety, out of battery safety, so on and so forth. And of course the trigger itself. This is not a super light trigger. It's about 6 pounds stock. That can be upped or downgraded as necessary depending on the pistol. We have a standard 4.5-inch barrel. Now this is a polymer frame, but it's very resistant. This polymer has been tested to make sure it doesn't corrode or get eaten away by all kinds of different chemicals, materials, situations. Additionally, it has kind of metal fibers reinforcing it, almost like a grid. So it does have metal in it. And of course there is a metal locking block where the barrel itself locks in. Now interestingly, this locking block is investment cast. Cheaper and easier to do by the standards of the 1980s. And when investment casting is done right, it's perfectly fine, as on the Glock. As is famously known, this has polygonal rifling. A lot of people think this was the first gun to have polygonal rifling. Actually, the Czechoslovakian, or I should say the first military service sidearm to have polygonal rifling. But interestingly, the Czechoslovakian VZ82 beat this one barely. But the VZ82 was designed before the 17 was finalized. So on and so forth. Now the original Gen 1s, there's no rail under the barrel. It's just rounded. Full-size grip. As you notice, there's just very light checkering on the sides and the back. The mag release is not reversible. It's very flush. We do have a slide release here. The original barrels used in the first couple of years were called the pencil barrel. This is not one, but this was actually originally a thinner barrel. Also, originally we had a 2-piece guide rod system where the spring was not captive. It was free. When you took the gun apart, it would come off the guide rod. The original mags were not drop free. I need to get an original mag because they're kind of interesting. They would actually intentionally swell up when loaded, And so when you hit the mag release, they would just kind of hang, and so you could pull them out. This was actually to satisfy the Austrian military. The original mags were also just pretty much polymer. They did not have much metal in them. As time would go on, they would add more and more metal, first around the feed lips, and then more and more around the frame as a kind of a skeleton. So they would be upgraded over time. But in the beginning, and as today, they were still a double-stack single feed with 17 rounds, the normal capacity for the standard-sized service pistol. So, adopted in 1982. The first few years, they would see some changes and kind of upgrade these. They would start to appear in America in '85 for the law enforcement and the commercial market. And the Austrian military would continue to purchase them. The initial order was for 25,000. They got them, they liked them, so they kept on buying throughout the 80s. There were several, like I said, upgrades and little changes. There was a recall in the late 80s where they replaced the internals. That's for a different day. However, in 1988, we have this here. Two things. We have the 19, the Glock 19. This is the compact model. It was actually introduced at the very tail end of Gen 1 production, so there are a handful of Gen 1 19s, but for the intents and purposes, the 19 came out around the time of the Gen II. Now you notice we go to 19. There was an 18 in the middle. It was introduced in 1986 and was a select fire machine pistol. Obviously it's not really civilian legal because it came out after the May of '86 prohibition on civilian owning transferable guns. So, yeah, it's pretty much a law enforcement thing, and Glock is very tight with it. But there is the Select Fire 18. It had a longer barrel, at least in the beginning. It could also be compensated in the beginning, and it could have a optional shoulder stock. It had a selector for both semi and full auto, of course. And it would have been issued initially with extended 31 round mags, and then later they would add a +2 base plate, coming up with the 33 round we know today. So anyway, we get to the 19 as the compact model. We have a 1/2 inch shorter barrel, bringing it to right about 4 inches. We also shorten the grip. It's still a large enough grip for most people to get their hand around it, but it's a little bit shorter. To go with, we also have a shorter 15 round mag. However, the 17 round mags, of course, as pretty much everyone knows, will fit. They'll just hang out. But that shows you just how much the grip was shortened, at least. The 31 or 33 round mags will also fit these. So this was introduced as a compact model and became popular. As far as the Gen II, aside from some just minor upgrades to the internals and things and safeties, we introduced a new pattern to the grip. We have more aggressive checkering and patterning on the back strap and the front strap. The sides are a little bit different, but almost exactly the same. Still do not have any kind of rail under the barrel. So the Gen II really wasn't a huge change from the Gen 1 except for the grip checkering. But of course that's a big deal because it does mean a better grip on the gun. But we still don't have anything really substantive changed with this. Although there was the recall, as I said, where we go to different internals for safety reasons. Also, the 19s will have a ribbed trigger, as you see. That's for import points. The 17 does not. Now, these guns would have all kinds of finishes over the years. Originally, we had a kind of a salt bath applied nitrided tinifer finish. And then after that, we had a parkerized or phosphated finish applied over. This would kind of look a little different over time as they would change up the phosphating and whatnot, but this was a very hard, durable finish, very corrosion resistant. That's why a lot of older Glocks still look quite good, even with a lot of use in them. Now, both the 17 and the 19 were adopted by the Swedish military. They would use them to replace their older Lottie M40 and even some really old Browning 1907 pistols. But we'll save that for the Swedish video. We did an old one on Swedish pistols time ago. We'll probably revisit that. But these would start to see Swedish service as the pistol or Pist 88, and they'd end up adopting both versions as time would go on. And this is really when the Glock hit the scene. Late 80s, a lot of law enforcement in the USA started to use them. My own brother was in law enforcement for 30 years, and he was initially issued a Smith & Wesson revolver, and then a Beretta 92 type pistol, and then finally a Glock Gen I, very similar to this gun here, which he kept for nearly 30 years actually, until it finally just gave up the ghost. It had a lot of rounds. Anyway, at first, a lot of them were really skeptical of this polymer-framed gun. It was very new, and of course there was the whole thing about airport, you know, there's kind of a stigma against it. Oh, these can be smuggled on the airplanes, which is obviously not true, as we know today. But once a lot of law enforcement got their hands on these, they really enjoyed them. They were simple to use. They didn't take as much training. They have a relatively low bore axis. You have all kinds of options starting to appear from Glock in the 90s. As I said, a good durable finish. Magazines were cheap and reliable, and as they would start to add more reinforcement and also drop free, that made it better. They quickly were won over once they saw these guns perform. And really once the law enforcement agencies started to accept these, the civilian market became interested. Now, it's worth pointing out that the cost was also a factor. These were quite a bit cheaper than full metal automatic guns of the day, or the so-called Wonder 9s. They were quite a bit cheaper, and they still had that nice Austrian pedigree. As a result, in 1995, the 26, the subcompact model, now I don't have one here, we'll throw up a picture, was introduced. Most people know about it, of course. We have an even shorter barrel, an even shorter grip, and we have a 10-round mag as standard. And while this was, you know, used by some law enforcement, it was really introduced for the civilian market as an early option for carry. And as the 90s would go on, we would introduce more and more variants, all kinds of things. And then in 1998, let's see if I can do a little rearranging here, guys. We would introduce the Generation III, as it was informally known. And we introduce a different pattern as well. This is the 34, introduced in 1998, right after the Generation III. As far as I know, there were never any Generation II 34s. This was their practical, tactical, or competition model. It was based on the earlier Glock 17L for long slide, which had about a 5.5 inch barrel. This has about a 5.3, so just a little bit shorter. And the name pretty much tells you what this was meant for. However, a large number of law enforcement users actually did purchase the 34. In fact, a batch of police trade-in 34s hit the market a couple of years ago. So these did see police use, which is interesting. Well, to go along with, the Gen III introduced a pretty new frame. We have the same patterning on the back strap as the two, same sides up to here, but now we have these finger or thumb rests. We also have finger grooves in the front. And most importantly, we have a Picatinny rail, or at least a Weaver rail, under the barrel here on the dust jacket. It only has one notch on this version, but at least it really was the first time you could install a device on a Glock. And if you think about it, the late 90s were really the beginning of pistol laser devices. Before that, you just didn't see them. This is also when the kind of, I think it's kind of colloquial known as the orange peel finish was around. This is just another variation of the nitride tinifer finish that came into use in the late 90s and ran through the early 2000s. As I said, both this and the Gen III were 1998. This particular one was made in 2002. And this is actually the gun that inspired me to do this video, and I'll explain at the end why. Well, other features of the 34. We have adjustable sights. We have an extended slide release with a little shelf on it. And we have an extended mag release, which just sticks out a bit. Not great for holster, but for competition, it's definitely easier to hit. You can even use your other finger to kind of wrap around and hit it if you have to, or you can do that. I definitely like this extended mag release. And finally, this has a lightened trigger. Whereas the standard trigger is about 6 pounds, I'd say this is about 3.5 on this gun. Of course, it is a little old and has been shot a good bit. But you get the idea, a couple of pounds lighter. And interestingly, because of this overall length, we're really about the same dimensions as a standard government 1911. This takes normal 17 shot mags as well. Now, of course, more and more models and variants will come to be over the early 21st century. Once the assault weapons ban ends, you really start to see interest in guns like this because people can buy high-capacity pistols with new mags before. Or I should say again, sorry guys. They would also introduce changes to the G Generation III. They would add a secondary pin to the frame, corresponding with a larger locking block. And that's really the most noticeable. They would keep the Gen IIIs in production. In fact, I think they're still in production to this day. But in 2010, they would change their way of applying finish. They would go from that salt dip nitride tinifer to kind of a gas nitride finish, still with phosphating on top. So this results in a different appearance after about 2010. Now, some people have say this was because of the American EPA. This tends to be a common explanation, but it's never been verified. And anyway, the change was originally done in Austria and then carried over to Glock USA. So I don't know, I'm not going to get into it. I will just say it's not even though it's repeated all the time at gun shows and gun shops, it hasn't really been verified by Glock. So it may or may not be true. You know how myths kind of get started. Another change they would introduce would be adding a loaded chamber indicator later on in Generation 3 production to the extractor, so you can know if you obviously had a round in the chamber. See, this one too has the rib trigger. This was a quite late production Gen 3 from about 3 years ago. And then we would move on to the Generation 4. This critter here. The Generation 4, as you see, is just another evolution. This is just a 17. Probably the biggest important thing about this is finally Glock themselves accepted the generation nomenclature and started roll marking the guns. So we're taking the standard gun. The grip is quite similar. We have a rougher texture on the sides and back. This was actually an evolution of the RTF, which is something that Glock played around with for a number of years. They would go kind of coarse and they would kind of make it a semi-RTF. They found basically the right coarseness, and then they would come out and put this on the Gen 4. They would also kind of slim down the finger grooves in the front and the whole grip. And this was because this was the first one to have, people call them interchangeable back straps. That's more like what would happen on the Walther. This actually just has additions. They have little grooves here. You can add on extensions to the back strap. And if you put the medium extension on, it's like earlier, for example, this one. So without any extensions, the grip on the Gen 4 is a little slimmer, which I personally like with my hands. This one's okay. I really like the Gen 2s as well. We have a larger mag release. It's still pretty flush, but it's larger, extended back. And for the first time, it's reversible. They did offer reversible mag releases as an option earlier on, but this really standardized it. And as you see, the magazines have to have cutouts on both sides to work with it. So while these will take older generation mags, they will only do so if you have your mag release, of course, on the standard left side for right-handed shooters. If you are a left-handed shooter, you'll need the newer Gen 4 mags. Finishes like you saw on that one. This also has a newer style of 2-spring guide spring. This was actually developed from the 26, which used it. The compact gun, or I should say the subcompact guns, used it, and they carried it over to the full size. They claim this helps control recoil a little better, lessens recoil, and I would agree. It's a little stiffer feeling. It seems like this gun does recoil a little less. It's probably just my imagination, but the trigger feels a little better on the Gen 4s too. I think they've cleaned it up a bit. It's a little smoother, less kind of creep. I don't know. It just feel, I mean, Glock triggers are not fantastic. Don't get me wrong, but it feels a little better on the Gen 4s to me. You have some other internal changes. They also did a recall in 2011 on these guide springs, swapping them out. They had a few early problems with the Gen 4. It's also worth noting that Gen 4 parts don't always interchange with older Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3 parts, whereas the other generations tended to be more or less interchangeable. Gen 4 introduced enough changes that really wasn't. That said, they very quickly worked out the bugs. I remember when these first started to come into the gun shop, people would say, well, why mess with Glock perfection? Kind of saying it tongue-in-cheek. In the earliest Gen 4s had a few teething issues, nothing too bad. But they worked it out, and now they're as reliable as the older Glocks, maybe even more so. And ergonomically, I would definitely say they're superior. The checkering on here is just enough to give you a really good grip. The finger grooves are less obnoxious than on the earlier guns, and the back straps are always a welcome. They even ship these with ones that have extended beaver tails in addition to just medium and large, so they actually give you 4 different extensions, which is nice. We still have the rail, which is fully Picatinny compatible on the Gen 4. And of course they make this in all the other versions too. Around 2013, the British Army selected the Glock Gen 4 as its next service pistol, the L131A1. It took them a couple of years to really get these into the field, but as with Austria, they had been using older high powers and frankly they were just worn out. I mean, they had some high powers that dated back to World War II that were even made up in Canada by Inglis, which the last year they made those was around October or November of 1945. So eventually they had to face reality that they had to get new guns, and so they went with the Glock Gen IV. They went with the 17 like this one here. That's actually why I own this one. It's kind of my representative British Glock. It's not exactly the same, but you get the idea. It's also worth noting that the British military did purchase a very small number of Walthers. They were the P5 compacts for use, especially in like Northern Ireland, that kind of area. So they had a few more modern guns as opposed to the high power, but for the most part that was the standard up until the Glock. And of course, most recently, and I don't have one here, sorry folks, the Gen V came out this year, middle of 2017, and it has a whole host of new features, kind of like with the Gen IV. It's not all that backward compatible part-wise with the newer, with the older guns. So, it's its own critter. Well, Glocks really aren't my thing. I'm more into historical guns, and it's not that I respect Glocks more than I like them, if that makes sense. They work, they're affordable, they're just very vanilla to me and most people in the gun industry. But over the years I've accumulated a few, as you see. The newer Gen III 19 is just out of the store. The rest are mine. The Gen IV I kind of just held back because I wanted to shoot it, and I've used it on a few different things to put it up against other guns. However, like I said, my brother was issued a Gen I back in the 80s, so that was the first Glock I ever really handled. And I always wanted to get a Gen I, and luckily I picked one up before they became collectible. I do find it a little funny that they're collectible now. And this is a pretty good example. I wouldn't mind getting a slightly earlier one with a few earlier features, but until one comes in my way, this will do just fine. So that's why I own this, and I actually kind of like the feel of the grip, the smooth grip, but then again, I'm not operating with it. I mean, it's objectively the newer ones are better, but for just interest, and this was the version that actually both the Swiss and the Swedish militaries, the Austrian and the Swedish militaries used. Switzerland does use the Glock, but a different, newer version, sorry. So that's why I picked this one up. Now this 34. I actually just got this back about 3 days ago. This was my very first Glock that I purchased. I bought this in 2002, new, from a local store. I had looked at the Glocks online, decided I wanted one, kind of went back and forth between the different versions, and for various reasons, kind of went with the 34. At the time, it was still quite new to the market, as was the Gen III. I liked the better trigger, the extended controls, the longer barrel. Even this cutout in the slide, even though it really is only there, people think sometimes this is for compensation. It's not really a compensator, of course, because the barrel is smooth and closed, but it is a weight. It's to balance out the weight, to keep the gun from not being too front heavy and keep the cycling correct. These guns are actually pretty well balanced out. The Glock put a lot of time and energy. These are very simple guns. There's only about 34 or 35 parts. But each part is very custom made, very specifically weighted and measured to work in this system. And to keep the slide working with this frame, that's why we did it. But yeah, this was my first Glock. Had it. Actually, the first time I took it out, it jammed. I guess, but it was new. That was with the 10-round mags that were mandatory back in the early 2000s during the assault weapons ban, when I actually got some law enforcement 17-round mags. It worked fine. And eventually I even sourced one of the early 31-round extended mags. But yeah, obviously after the couple of rounds, it broke in and ran just great. And ever since then, has been a fantastic shooter. I owned it for probably 4 years, and then traded it off to a family member for one reason or another. It might have even been to get my original SAR-1 back. I honestly don't recall right now. But anyway, it's been in the hands of a family member for over 10 years. And just this week, he picked up one of the new 34 Gen IV MOSs in the green, in the OD green. And so he really did not need this older Gen III 34. That said, it actually took quite a bit of doing to still get him to release it, because he thought for a time, well, he wanted one 34 with the with an optic on it, and one with the iron sights. But anyway, I ended up with it again, and I'm happy to do it. One thing, it's really has a nice trigger. It's a good shooter, and I've always liked kind of the 34 profile. And since these have seen at least police use, it's legitimate enough for my collection. Well, that's my little rundown of Glocks for what it's worth. Again, I'm honestly pretty much a novice with these. I just know the history, the service, and how they came to be, and that's about it. All the little generations and engineering changes aren't really my thing. But these are very, very popular guns around the world and in the USA. They're made in both Austria and the USA. There are millions out there. I wouldn't be shocked if it was 10 million now. And obviously, of course, there's the whole Glock versus SIG thing in the XM17 trials that happened just about a year ago. We will do that. I do have a P320, and we've got the Glocks, but that's a story for a different video and a range day. Today it's nice and raining and about 35 degrees out, so not the best time to go shooting. So I thought we would just kind of do a tabletop Glock talk. I know a lot of you will have your own things to say, and I know there are things that I got wrong, and that's fine. I really do want you to point them out in the comments, but I just ask if you would do it politely, because, this is just something we do for fun. I'm not pretending to be an expert or anything. So feel free to correct me. I will take that in mind, but I just wanted to kind of show Glocks a bit and go through the generations up to at least 4. And if you liked the video, please click like. And if you have not already subscribed, this video is a little abnormal for our content, but you might want to check out what else we've done and see if it also interests you. And tune in again next time for hopefully another interesting video. This is Misha, and we'll catch you then.